Ladies and gentlemen, history often moves not in the open corridors of parliaments, but in the quiet rooms where deals are struck and alliances are tested. Today, I invite you to consider what it truly means when we speak of the hidden Trump-Putin agreements in Alaska. Whether whispered in diplomatic circles or dismissed as rumor, such agreements carry the potential to reshape the global balance of power. The real question is not whether these talks happened exactly as reported, but what they reveal about the world we are entering, a world where backroom diplomacy is as decisive as open declarations. The most decisive shifts in global politics are not announced with fanfare on television, nor are they paraded before the public with full transparency. They occur quietly in dimly lit rooms where power brokers speak in guarded tones, far from the scrutiny of the ordinary citizen. Secrecy shapes destiny because it allows decisions of immense consequence to be made without the consent or even the awareness of the people whose lives will be most affected. This is the uncomfortable truth about the hidden agreements we discuss today. Agreements whispered in Alaska or elsewhere, framed not for the public eye but for the strategic calculations of statesmen. And the hook that should pierce our attention is this: if history is written behind closed doors, then the public becomes an audience to its consequences rather than an author of its future. When leaders meet in secrecy, they do so under the premise that diplomacy requires discretion. Indeed, there is a logic to it. Negotiations often demand silence, for premature disclosure can derail progress. Yet what begins as discretion often mutates into exclusion, where the public is deliberately kept ignorant, not for the sake of success, but for the sake of control. The citizen is told only what maintains loyalty, while the realities of compromise, trade-offs, and shifting alliances are buried under narratives of strength and moral clarity. This is the mechanism by which secrecy evolves into manipulation. And here lies another hook. When secrecy stops protecting peace and begins protecting power, it ceases to serve the people and begins to enslave them. In the case of hidden Trump-Putin agreements, the secrecy carries profound symbolic weight. Why Alaska? Because geography speaks louder than rhetoric. The narrow Bering Strait separates the United States from Russia, reminding us that adversaries are often neighbors. If dialogue is unavoidable, then the public deserves to understand what is being discussed in their name. Yet they are not told. They are instead handed selective fragments, shaped by the media and political elites to ensure that interpretation aligns with pre-designed narratives. The secrecy ensures that the citizen does not question why compromise is necessary or what concessions may have been made. Instead, they are left with speculation, and speculation breeds mistrust. And the hook that grips us here is simple secrecy without accountability is not diplomacy, it is deception. There is also a profound moral cost to secrecy. When people are excluded from understanding the stakes, they are deprived of the ability to make informed choices about their own future. If conflict erupts, they are told it was inevitable. If peace emerges, they are told it was achieved through strength alone. Both stories conceal the truth that hidden agreements were shaping outcomes all along. By controlling the narrative, leaders manufacture consent, and by manufacturing consent, they strip citizens of sovereignty. This is not simply a political slight, it is a theft of agency. And the hook that we must not release is that freedom is not only the right to speak, but the right to know. Without knowledge, freedom itself becomes an illusion. Secrecy also alters the way history is remembered. When records are kept classified, when deals are denied, when truths are buried beneath layers of national security, the past is rewritten to serve the needs of the present. Generations later, historians uncover the fragments and citizens realize they were misled. But by then, the consequences are already lived, the wars already fought, the opportunities for peace already lost. The hidden agreements in Alaska, whether large or small, fit into this pattern of history. They reveal how great powers shape the trajectory of entire civilizations while the people remain in the dark. And the hook that lingers here is haunting. Secrecy is not a temporary. It echoes through generations, shaping what is remembered, what is forgotten, and what is repeated. Therefore, to understand the weight of secrecy is to understand the fragility of destiny. A people who accept secrecy as normal accept the erosion of their role in history. They trade agency for comfort, sovereignty for ignorance, and end up bound by choices they never agreed to. The hidden agreements remind us that silence is never neutral. To remain unaware is to surrender power, and to surrender power is to surrender the very right to shape the future, the piercing truth, the hook that compels us forward. Is this: if you do not demand to know what is decided in your name, then the destiny being written is not yours at all, but theirs. Geography has always been the silent architect of politics, shaping destinies long before ideologies, treaties, or even national borders were drawn. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity, for no leader, no government can rewrite the map. This is why Alaska becomes more than a place, it becomes a symbol. It is where America and Russia stand as neighbors, separated only by a narrow stretch of water, forced into an eternal relationship defined by proximity. Leaders may build walls of rhetoric, but geography erases those walls. The hook that must capture our attention is clear. While ideology can be abandoned and alliances can shift, geography remains the one force that cannot be escaped, and it compels dialogue even when dialogue is unpopular. When we speak of hidden agreements between Trump and Putin in Alaska, we are really speaking of geography demanding recognition. The Bering Strait is a mere 55 miles wide, and on a clear day one can glimpse the other side. This proximity challenges the illusion that the two nations are worlds apart. The reality is that their fates are intertwined, whether through trade routes, energy corridors, or the shared frontier of the Arctic. Yet the public is rarely invited to think of Russia as a neighbor. Instead, it is painted as an eternal enemy. This dissonance between geography and narrative is where secrecy thrives, and the hook that must not be forgotten is this: when narratives deny geography, it is only the people who pay the cost of such denial. Geography dictates that cooperation is not an option but a necessity. The Arctic, increasingly navigable due to climate change, is set to become one of the most strategic regions of the 21st century. Shipping lanes that shorten global trade routes, untapped reserves of energy and minerals, and strategic military positioning all converge in this frozen frontier. If the United States and Russia do not establish understandings, conflict becomes the default. Yet when agreements are made, they are often shrouded in secrecy, as if acknowledging cooperation undermines the public appetite for rivalry. The irony is striking: cooperation ensures security, yet it must be hidden from the very people whose security it protects. The hook here is powerful. When cooperation is concealed and rivalry is glorified, societies are conditioned to embrace danger while rejecting the very tools of survival. Even beyond the Arctic, the simple fact of neighborhood forces the United States and Russia to consider shared interests. Alaska's strategic location places it at the intersection of the Pacific and Arctic, making it both a shield and a bridge. For centuries, empires have been defined by their ability to secure borders, yet borders that touch inevitably demand negotiation. Whether it is fisheries, environmental regulation, or military presence, the proximity of Alaska to Russia demands ongoing engagement. The hook that demands attention is this: neighbors may fight, but neighbors cannot ignore one another, and the attempt to do so always leads to instability. The tragedy is that the public is rarely allowed to see cooperation as natural. The prevailing narrative insists that any interaction with Russia is a betrayal, that dialogue itself is weakness, and that rivalry is the only legitimate path. Yet geography does not bend to narrative. It imposes its own rules, regardless of whether leaders acknowledge them. This is why hidden agreements exist. They are the quiet recognition that ideology cannot erase geography. But when such agreements are kept secret, the public is deprived of the truth that cooperation is not betrayal but necessity. The hook that emerges is stark when societies are trained to despise the logic of geography. They are trained to despise their own survival. Alaska reminds us that the world is smaller than it appears on a map. It strips away illusions of distance and forces us to confront the reality that even great powers cannot live in isolation. The hidden agreements between Trump and Putin may remain obscured, but their very existence points to a deeper truth, that proximity creates obligations, and obligations create dialogue. The question is not whether dialogue will occur, but whether citizens will recognize its inevitability and demand transparency in its execution. And the hook that leaves us unsettled is this: if geography compels dialogue, then to deny it is to deny reality itself, and no society can survive long while living in denial. Peace in our time is too often portrayed as a fantasy, as if the only language nations can speak is the language of rivalry and war. Yet what truly requires courage in politics is not the ability to threaten or escalate, but the willingness to sit across from an adversary and find common ground when everything in the surrounding environment screams against it. To extend a hand where others raise fists demands strength of character, not weakness. This is the paradox that too few in the West dare to acknowledge. Dialogue with Russia is not a capitulation, but an act of maturity. And the hook that should strike deeply is this: when peace is treated as treason, war becomes the only path left open. Consider the way public discourse is framed. A leader who dares to speak with Russia is branded as compromised, soft, or even dangerous. Dialogue is equated with betrayal, while hostility is dressed up as patriotism. This inversion of logic conditions entire societies to reject the very tools of peace. By this standard, the bravest act, reaching for understanding, is ridiculed, while the most reckless act, pushing toward confrontation, is celebrated. This is not strength, it is self-destruction disguised as resolve. The hook we must hold is clear: societies that punish peace and glorify conflict have already chosen the path of decline. The hidden agreements between Trump and Putin, if they indeed existed, serve as an example of this courage. While the public narrative was one of endless hostility, the very existence of secret talks reveals that even adversaries recognized the need for restraint. To negotiate in Alaska was to acknowledge geography, proximity, and mutual vulnerability. Yet these discussions could never be celebrated openly, for the climate of fear would brand them illegitimate. The courage required to make these agreements was not simply in confronting the adversary across the table, but in confronting one's own domestic critics who demand permanent enmity. And the hook here is powerful. True courage is not measured by how loudly one can denounce an enemy, but by how firmly one can resist the crowd that demands it. Peace requires courage because it requires imagination. It demands that leaders look beyond the present hostility and envision a future where cooperation is possible. This is no easy task. It is far simpler to claim that an adversary is irredeemable, that dialogue is futile, and that war is inevitable. Fatalism absolves leaders of responsibility while vision burdens them with it. A peace-minded leader must accept ridicule, suspicion, and resistance, yet persist because the alternative is too devastating to contemplate. The hook that captures us here is undeniable. The imagination to see peace where others see only war is not Nava. It is revolutionary. This courage also extends to the people themselves. Citizens must reject the manipulation that tells them peace is weakness. They must question the narratives that glorify perpetual hostility. They must demand that their leaders negotiate even when it is unpopular, because survival itself depends on it. When ordinary people internalize the idea that dialogue is betrayal, they surrender their agency and embrace conflict as destiny. But when they reclaim the belief that peace is strength, they empower themselves to hold leaders accountable. And the hook that should resonate in every heart is simple: the courage of peace is not the burden of leaders alone. It is the responsibility of all. History provides countless examples of leaders condemned for daring to speak with adversaries, only to be vindicated by time. Those who negotiated arms control during the Cold War were often branded as appeasers, yet it was their courage that prevented nuclear catastrophe. The same lesson applies today. Dialogue with Russia is not appeasement, but necessity, not treason, but survival. The refusal to engage ensures only escalation, while the willingness to engage opens the possibility. The hook that should echo in our minds is this: it takes little courage to follow the drums of war, but it takes immense courage to silence them. Peace requires courage because it is never the easy road. It is the road of criticism, risk, and vision. It asks leaders to defy expectations, citizens to challenge narratives, and societies to rethink what true strength means. The hidden agreements remind us that even in the darkest climates of hostility, dialogue continues in secret because reality demands it. The tragedy is that such courage must often be hidden. The challenge before us is to make it visible, legitimate, and celebrated, for only then can peace emerge not as treason, but as triumph. The Arctic is no longer a frozen expanse at the edge of maps. It is fast becoming the new center of gravity in global politics. As the ice melts, shipping lanes open, resources become accessible, and military strategies shift. This is why Alaska is not just symbolic in the context of hidden Trump-Putin agreements. It is strategic. It represents the entry point into a region that will determine the economic and security architecture of the 21st century. Leaders may keep such discussions secret to avoid domestic backlash, but the reality is unavoidable. Whoever shapes the Arctic shapes the future. And the hook that grips us immediately is this: ignore the Arctic today and you will live under the rules written by others tomorrow. Consider what is at stake. Beneath the Arctic lies vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals that will be essential for powering economies in the decades ahead. Control over these resources is not merely about wealth, but about sovereignty and survival. At the same time, the Northern Sea Road, running along Russia's northern coastline, offers a shipping shortcut between Europe and Asia that can redefine global trade. If agreements are made in secret about who accesses these routes and resources, then entire nations will feel the impact without ever knowing the negotiations occurred. And here lies a sharp hook. The Arctic is not the periphery. It is the front line of the new global order, and those left outside the decision-making process will pay the highest price. Military strategy also converges in the Arctic. The United States, Russia, and increasingly China understand that control of the polar region means control of critical vantage points. Alaska is home to U.S. strategic assets, while Russia has revitalized its northern military bases. Submarines patrol beneath the ice, bombers fly overhead, and new technologies are deployed to secure dominance. The public hears little of this, yet it shapes the balance of power more profoundly than many of the conflicts dominating headlines. The secrecy surrounding any Trump-Putin agreements in Alaska signals that leaders are acutely aware of the stakes. They recognize that cooperation and restraint are necessary, but they cannot admit this publicly without undermining the narrative of rivalry. And the hook is sobering when military escalation is celebrated, but restraint must be hidden. The road to war is paved with silence. The Arctic also forces us to confront the hypocrisy of narratives. While the West often presents Russia as reckless in asserting its Arctic claims, the truth is that all major powers are engaged in the same competition. The United States expands its military presence, Canada asserts its sovereignty, and China declares itself a near-Arctic state. In this scramble, cooperation is unavoidable. Yet secrecy prevails because to admit shared interests would weaken the ideological framing of eternal rivalry. This reveals a critical truth. The competition is real, but the rejection of cooperation is artificial. The hook here is crucial. When ideology denies cooperation, it is ideology that becomes the greatest threat to security. Hidden agreements remind us that beneath the noise of confrontation lies the quiet logic of geography and necessity. Trump and Putin, if they indeed discussed Arctic matters in Alaska, were acknowledging that proximity compels dialogue. They understood that unmanaged competition would spiral into conflict, while negotiated rules could prevent disaster. Yet the public was not invited to see this logic, because admitting it would require acknowledging Russia as a legitimate partner in shaping the future. And the hook that should jolt us awake is this: when legitimacy is denied for political reasons, the cost is borne not by elites but by citizens who inherit instability. The Arctic is tomorrow's battlefield only if we allow it to be. It can also be tomorrow's bridge, where shared challenges, climate change, trade, and resource management force cooperation. But for that to happen, secrecy must give way to transparency, and rivalry must give way to responsibility. The agreements in Alaska, hidden from the public eye, remind us that the future is already being written in the polar north. The question is whether people will awaken to this reality before the script is finished without them. And the hook that lingers is stark in the Arctic. The choice is not between rivalry and cooperation, but between survival and decline. The Arctic is a mirror reflecting the contradictions of modern geopolitics, where the rhetoric of hostility collides with the undeniable logic of cooperation. At the heart of this lies a paradox: nations publicly escalate tensions, while privately recognizing the necessity of collaboration. If Trump and Putin held hidden agreements in Alaska, they would not be a betrayal of national interests, but an acknowledgement of this unavoidable reality. The Arctic cannot be mastered by unilateral ambition. It demands cooperation because its challenges are too vast and its opportunities too transformative. The hook that cuts deep is this: when leaders secretly negotiate cooperation, it proves that even the loudest voices of rivalry are quietly admitting the futility of conflict. Energy shipping and climate change intertwine in the Arctic like no other region on Earth. The melting ice opens access to untapped oil and gas reserves, offering the potential for new economic booms. Yet extracting these resources without international coordination risks environmental catastrophe and geopolitical clashes. Shipping routes shorten global trade distances, but also require shared rules to avoid accidents and disputes. Climate change itself accelerates these changes, reminding all nations that the Arctic is not just a battleground of interests, but a test of humanity's capacity for stewardship. To handle this, cooperation is not optional, it is inevitable. But here lies the hook that demands attention. When cooperation is treated as a shameful secret, the public is left unprepared for the shared future their leaders are already shaping behind closed doors. The paradox intensifies when military considerations are added. The Arctic is being remilitarized, with submarines prowling beneath the ice and aircraft testing each other's resolve above it. Alaska hosts U.S. assets critical for deterrence, while Russia revives its Arctic bases. Publicly, leaders amplify the rhetoric of confrontation, feeding narratives of imminent threat. Yet strategically, both sides understand the danger of uncontrolled escalation in such a fragile environment. This is why even adversaries need tacit agreements about flight paths, submarine patrols, and incident management. To admit this openly would expose the artificiality of absolute enmity. And here lies another sharp hook. The louder the performance of rivalry, the greater the hidden reliance on cooperation to keep the performance from becoming a tragedy. The secrecy of Arctic negotiations also exposes the failure of political imagination in the West. Admitting cooperation with Russia is painted as weakness, even treachery, yet the reality is that without Russia, there is no Arctic strategy. Geography dictates this truth more powerfully than ideology. The northern sea route lies along Russia's coast, its infrastructure dominates the region, and its resources are indispensable. Any American or European leader who refuses dialogue with Moscow is not protecting sovereignty but surrendering it, because they are choosing ideology over geography. That is the paradox leaders hide. They know cooperation is essential, yet they conceal it to preserve the illusion of independence. And the hook here is undeniable. When ideology demands silence about reality, the result is not strength, but blindness. Citizens deserve to know the truth about this paradox, because they will live with the consequences of secrecy. If leaders continue to frame the Arctic as purely a stage for confrontation, the public will expect aggression and be shocked when cooperation emerges. Conversely, if leaders negotiate secretly, citizens are robbed of the chance to shape the future through democratic debate. Hidden Trump-Putin agreements in Alaska embody this dilemma. Cooperation occurs, but in shadows, while the public narrative insists on perpetual rivalry. The hook that should wake us from complacency is this: when people are excluded from the truth, the line between leadership and manipulation begins to blur. The Arctic paradox is thus a warning. It tells us that cooperation and conflict are not mutually exclusive, but deeply entwined. Leaders may dramatize rivalry, but they cannot escape the gravitational pull of shared interests. What matters is whether cooperation is conducted in secrecy or in the open, whether it is treated as weakness or embraced as necessity. The stakes could not be higher. Peace in the Arctic could become the foundation of stability for the century ahead, while neglecting this paradox could turn the region into the spark of the next great power conflict. And the final hook is as clear as the icy horizon. The Arctic teaches us that cooperation denied is not cooperation avoided. It is simply cooperation delayed until crisis forces it upon us at a far greater cost. Hidden agreements remind us of a sobering truth. History is not only written by leaders, but also shaped in silence, behind doors, where the public has no access. When Trump and Putin meet in Alaska or anywhere else, the official narrative will highlight confrontation, suspicion, and rivalry, yet the very existence of unspoken understandings demonstrates that real power often operates in the shadows. This raises the most pressing question: do the people accept being mere spectators in their own history, or do they rise to claim authorship? Because if the people remain passive, history will not be something they write, it will be something imposed upon them. The hook here is unmistakable. The choice is never between participation and silence. The choice is between shaping the future or being shaped by it. When governments negotiate in secrecy, they may justify it as a necessity for national security or diplomatic sensitivity. And yes, some degree of confidentiality is inevitable, but when secrecy becomes the norm, it transforms into exclusion. Citizens are not just protected from dangerous information, they are stripped of agency. The narrative is curated, simplified to good versus evil, allies versus enemies, strength versus weakness. Yet the truth is always more complicated, more layered, more human, and that complexity is precisely what empowers societies to think critically and act responsibly. By hiding it, leaders cultivate dependency. The public becomes a passive consumer of narratives rather than an active participant in history. And here is this sharp hook: when knowledge is rationed, freedom is rationed alongside it. The hidden Trump-Putin agreements in Alaska symbolize this tension vividly. Perhaps they discussed Arctic cooperation, or military deconfliction, or energy exchanges. These are not trivial matters. They are issues that will shape security, trade, and the environment for generations. If the people are kept ignorant of such decisions, they cannot prepare for the consequences, nor can they hold their leaders accountable. Instead, they are told a one-sided story of rivalry, of fear, of standing firm. Meanwhile, quiet channels of collaboration operate beneath the surface. The danger here is not merely deception, it is the erosion of democracy itself. The hook that should alarm us all is this: democracy dies not only in the absence of elections, but in the absence of truth. To claim ownership of history, citizens must demand transparency and cultivate independent thinking. This does not mean rejecting diplomacy or cooperation. It means insisting on honesty about its existence. It means recognizing that agreements with adversaries are not betrayals but necessities. It means asking, why must these dialogues be hidden? Who benefits from secrecy? What do we lose when silence becomes strategy? These are questions that awaken agency. They remind us that sovereignty belongs not only to states but also to societies. The hook here is simple yet powerful. Only an informed public can prevent secret diplomacy from becoming secret manipulation. History offers endless lessons about the consequences of public exclusion. Empires have collapsed when elites made decisions in shadows, while citizens marched blindly into wars they never chose. Nations have suffered when secrecy replaced accountability, when loyalty to narratives was valued more than loyalty to truth. The tragedy is that these lessons are repeated not because they are forgotten, but because people are lulled into complacency. The public must reclaim history as their own, or else risk reliving its darkest cycles. And here lies another hook. Ignorance is not innocence, it is vulnerability. The people must therefore rise to see hidden agreements not as mysteries too complex to understand, but as reminders of their responsibility to demand clarity. Leaders will always act in self-interest. It is the role of society to ensure that self-interest does not become the only compass of history. Alaska is not just a symbol of geography, it is a symbol of accountability, a frontier where two powers meet, yes, but also a frontier where secrecy must give way to scrutiny. The hidden Trump-Putin agreements serve as a call not to suspicion but to awakening. And the most urgent hook of all is this: history will be written either with you or without you. The question is, will you seize the pen, or will you allow others to write your future in silence?